With the New Year's Day around the corner, we are able to interview Professor Joseph Nye, who is regularly listed among the top international relations academics in the world and perhaps the top American academic in the field. He was instrumental in creating concepts like neoliberalism, soft power, and smart power. All of these are now commonly used phrases in discussions on politics, whether by high-level policymakers, media commentators, or friends exchanging thoughts over a few beers. Dr. Nye did not restrict himself to the academic world. He also put his ideas into action while serving in the Clinton and Obama administrations. We are honored today to speak exclusively with Dr. Nye and find out more about his career and his theories that have shaped political dialogue in recent decades. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. By the end of 2017, people start to review major events. However, it's the people that make the world look more interesting or boring, or they make the world more dangerous. So people matter. People behind the events that matter eventually more to those who observe and follow developments of economic and political movement. So in your view, why Me Too, a group of women have been elected People of the Year by the Time magazine?
Well, there's been a major change in terms of how men treat women and the so-called sexual harassment. And there has been a willingness to speak up against the mistreatment of women, which has started with the exposures of Harvey Weinstein, the film mogul, and it's then gone on to others. It's led to the resignations of important journalists like Bill O'Reilly. And in general, there's been a feeling that men who are abusive to women should be called out and exposed for it. And that means that other women have joined to expose this, and that's called Me Too. Women who are saying, I also suffered and I'm not going to put up with it anymore. So I think Time magazine was expressing admiration for these women by making them the Person of the Year on the cover of Time magazine.
Let me look at Bill Clinton, who had the Lewinsky scandal, yet he failed to be impeached by the Congress. That's unfair, right?
Well, what happened with Clinton is the House of Representatives actually voted a bill of impeachment. But then in the American system, to remove the president from office, that bill of impeachment has to be passed by 2/3 of the Senate. So in the trial in the Senate, Clinton didn't, there was not a 2/3 vote to remove him. So he actually was impeached by the House, but not removed by the Senate.
Secretary Clinton was one of the most outspoken women politicians in the United States. And yet, the alleged power partnership between her and her husband impressed the world. Despite her devastating setback to win the presidency, of course she won the popular votes by a big margin of 3 million, according to the estimation and the statistics. What do you think of the uniqueness of this alleged power partnership between the president and the secretary?
Well, the Clintons did work very closely together in politics for decades. What is remarkable is the fact that somebody who had been First Lady became a presidential candidate herself, and also before that she had run for the Senate and succeeded as a senator and then become a Secretary of State. So unlike most First Ladies who are merely reflecting the power of their husband when they're in office, she went on to build her own political base. And so in that sense, she was a very rare person in American politics.
Talking about the influence of family members in American politics, no one could surpass or outsmart first daughter of the presidency, Ivanka. Do you think American Constitution and laws protect the influence of family members? Because in Eastern cultures, this will be a very sensitive issue. Family members, particularly First Lady, tends to be barred from getting involved in politics. And look at Zimbabwe, though a remote country in Africa. Grace Mugabe was ousted by the military because of her ambition, her political ambition. Now, we don't know anything about American culture in terms of family members' influence.
Well, traditionally, there have been family members who've had influence, but never to the extent to which Ivanka Trump or her husband Jared Kushner have, in the sense that they have had open positions in the White House. Jimmy Carter's brother Billy Carter had an influence in the Carter administration. There was a Bush, George H.W. Bush, brother who had some influence, so forth. But this was just informal. What's different about the Trump administration is that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner have been given more official positions in the White House.
Is that legal?
Well, it's legal because the president can choose who he wants as an advisor. I think it's a difference between being legal and being wise. I think there's a danger of overdoing that. I suppose the closest precedent would be when John Kennedy made his brother Robert Kennedy Attorney General, which was an official position. And there were a lot of people who said that was a mistake. But so it's not totally unheard of, but I think it does raise interesting problems when you take a family member and make them a close legal counselor.
Ivanka, the first daughter, was invited to address a big crowd in Moscow recently, and that has left Rex Tillerson a little bit marginalized, according to the rumors on American politics. What's the latest about the news event or the news story that Secretary Tillerson might resign because of the loggerheads he has with the president?
Well, there have been press stories saying that he was about to be replaced by Pompeo, the current director of the CIA, who previously was a congressman from the Midwest. But that has been officially denied by the White House. Nonetheless, I think a lot of people in Washington expect that Tillerson's days are numbered. There was a news story that last summer Tillerson called President Trump a moron.
Which means?
Which means stupid. And this is not officially confirmed, but not completely denied either. But in any case, it indicates that the relationship between Secretary Tillerson and President Trump is not that close.
Major news stories these days would, of course, include the decision by President Trump to accept Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. What kind of impact would that produce on the Middle East, which starts to be volatile and turbulent again due to the proxy wars in Yemen and Syria, to say nothing of, say, the oil prices and the domestic politics of Saudi Arabia, head of the GCC group?
Well, I think the recognition is probably a mistake in the sense that it makes it much more difficult for Abbas and Palestinians who were interested in trying to work with Israel to have a firm basis. There'll be strong opposition to them. It also will offend other Arab countries, which would be useful or necessary in the peace process. And to give you an example of what we were just talking about, of people who are expert, Dennis Ross, who had been an advisor on the Middle East for both Republicans and Democrats, wrote an article recently saying this was a bad mistake. So I would say this is a good example.
But it's just domestic politics, right?
I think it's largely domestic politics in the sense that some of Trump's strongest supporters in the campaign were people who were pressing him to do this.
Who are those people?
Well, according to the newspapers, Sheldon Adelson, who was a casino owner, had been a strong supporter of President Trump. And I think he had probably took this position, though I don't have direct evidence of it.
But do you think those supporters are mostly Christian fundamentalists?
Well, no, I think you find a mixture in support of Israel, both Jewish Americans and Christian evangelicals.
Mm-hmm. Well, Christian evangelicals, this is the phrase you use. Yeah. What about North Korea? Let's come back to examine the dangerous realities that we face in Northeast Asia. Do you think the war is about to break out?
I don't think there's about to be a war, but I was at a meeting recently with a number of people who follow this closely in Washington, and in the discussion, the estimates they had were that there was about a 1 in 4 chance that there would be some use of force. So that's much less than 50%, but it's still quite high.
Pyongyang has asked Russians to convey a message to Washington that they're going to talk. They're going to have a one-on-one dialogue with Washington to avert a war. Well, that's the understatement of this request by Pyongyang. Does it mean Mr. Kim Jong-un, leader of the DPRK, is blinking in the standoff? Does it show the signs of weakness for this regime?
I don't think so. The North Koreans have long said that they wanted direct negotiations with the United States, and that's their way to try to break the relationship between the United States and South Korea. One of the objectives of the Kim Jong-un regime is to demonstrate that North Korea represents true Korean nationalism, and even though South Korea has been more successful economically, that North Korea is more successful militarily through its nuclear program. So bringing the Americans to the table to negotiate is something that the North Koreans have tried to do for a long time. So I don't think this is a new policy. What would be new would be if the North Koreans were to stop testing nuclear explosions and to stop testing intercontinental missiles. That would be an indication of seriousness. But just talking is not an indication of seriousness, because in the past we've talked to them, we've even reached an agreement, as in 2007, and they then lie and they break the agreement. So talking doesn't mean anything in terms of North Korea. It's actions, and the actions that count will be to cease testing.
Why do you think a test of intercontinental ballistic missiles would be a serious threat to your homeland security?
I think the Trump administration, but also...
Because the DPRK would never ever use them without being provoked seriously by its enemy. So why do you have the fears?
Well, I think the argument that is that if the North Koreans think they can hit the United States with a nuclear weapon, that will deter the United States from protecting South Korea. So if you go back to 2010, in which the North Koreans sank a South Korean naval frigate, the Chonan, and shelled islands along the border, killing Yanping Islands, killing South Koreans, they would feel more at liberty to do that if they felt they could deter the United States with a nuclear threat.
Do you think if they dare to go as far as to sink another South Korean boat or kill more South Koreans in the small island, there's definitely be a war?
I think the South Koreans said in 2010 that if the North Koreans kept this up, they would respond by force. And if they do, then I think one thing may lead to another and escalate, and there might be a war.
What do you think should be the solution to the dilemma, the security dilemma in the Korean Peninsula? Do you still expect China to play our role?
I think that Henry Kissinger is correct, that the secret to success here is for the United States and Beijing to work very closely together. I think the U.S. should reassure China that we are not trying to have an advantage in which American troops would go into North Korea or approach the Yalu River as in 1950. So we should reassure China on that, and we should say to China that if China can get North Korea to stop testing, both nuclear and missile testing, we will look forward to talks, and the talks could lead over a process of time to various adjustments. It would have to require North Korea to have a détente with South Korea, no threats to South Korea, and in that context the U.S. could think about the issue of eventually a peace treaty with North Korea. But this would require China to take a very strong position and tell North Korea that if they test, that breaks the talks and breaks the process. We're not going to sit down with the North Koreans and be lied to again, as we've been lied to before. We will look for actions. The actions will be a cessation of testing, and if that testing resumes, that's the end of the process. So I agree that the secret to success here is for U.S. and China to work closely together, and that China's role will be to say to Kim Jong-un, you stop the testing or else.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Joseph Nye, former president of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. He's also the first who raised the concept of soft power. Later on, he used smart power to enrich his understanding about the use of attractiveness and persuasion instead of the use of gunboat policy in international politics. We shall be back in a few minutes. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, sir. In your view, what the future would be like for the United States and China? One is the existing power, the other the rising power. Do you think Thucydides' tribe would be applicable in characterizing the uncertainties in the future?
No, I tend to be rather optimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations.
Optimistic or cautiously optimistic?
Cautiously optimistic is the better way to put it, because we should never underestimate the capacity of human beings, whether Chinese or American, to make mistakes. So if you go back, let's say, to 1914, on the eve of World War I, which was a total disaster for Europe, nobody expected a large war growing out of a small event, which was an assassination in Sarajevo. So one set of miscalculations led to another, which led to a disaster which claimed tens of millions of lives. So you're right, I stand corrected, cautiously optimistic. But with that said, the U.S. and China don't pose existential threats to each other. China is not trying to end the United States. The United States is not trying to end China the way, let's say, that Stalin's Soviet Union wanted to end the American system or American way of life. So China and the U.S. have a relationship which will have both competition and cooperation. But we have a lot more to gain from the cooperation than the competition. So both parts will exist. But I think if we look at the situation of our countries dispassionately, we both have much more to gain from cooperation than from competition that might degenerate into war. That's different from the Thucydides trap.
There have been novel ideas about G2 or co-evolution, either by Dr. Henry Kissinger or Dr. Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor to the Carter administration. No one stands taller than those who stand corrected. So I appreciate your readiness to correct your rhetoric and wording. Having said this, the United States has been licking its wounds since Vietnam War, the second most bloody regional conflict following the Korean War in the early 1950s. Do you think the United States has made some very bad mistakes in the post-war era since 1945? What lessons would the Pentagon or the White House learn to avoid repeating the vulnerabilities and the dangers, so that we can have a peaceful evolution and we will be able to manage our differences and would work in partnership to overcome the disputes that may threaten to trigger a war or hostilities?
Our two biggest mistakes that the United States made after 1945 were the Vietnam War and the invasion of Iraq. And I think what we should have learned from that is you cannot rule a less developed country which is going through internal social change. You have to let them work out these problems for themselves, whether you like it or don't like it. And I think that those, to my mind, are the two biggest mistakes. But I think on the management of the great power relations, I think the first President Bush managed the end of the Cold War quite well. As he put it, after the Berlin Wall collapsed, he said he was not going to dance on the wall. He was not going to humiliate Gorbachev. So I think the Americans handled that well. And on the relationship of the rise of China, which goes back really to President Clinton and the period I was in the Clinton administration, we said if we try to contain China, it would be a great mistake. I remember testifying to Congress saying, if you treat China as an enemy, you're guaranteeing an enemy. But if you treat China as a friend, it may become a friendly relationship.
That's a very nice self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, I think it's largely true. If you look at the Clinton administration then supported China joining the World Trade Organization, unlike containment of the Soviet Union, where we had no trade and no social contacts. There are 300,000 Chinese students in American universities, as well as massive trade between us. And for all the differences that we sometimes have, the two countries actually get along reasonably well. If we look ahead, China is going to rise. If we try to stop it, we can make a mess. If we try to make room for China, we could have a reasonable relationship. And I think that's proven true.
That's a pretty reasonable vision. However, you did that in the hope, allegedly, to engage China and to transform China from the current communist leadership into a Western democracy. But China refused to do that. China refused to follow your therapy and the roadmap. Do you think more and more Americans have been left disillusioned and they say, well, this would prompt the United States and policymakers to reconsider, to reassess the bilateral relationship? What do you think of the consequences?
Well, I personally never thought China would be a Western democracy with a parliament like the British Parliament or a Congress like the American Congress, I did think it would probably have more openness both in market and political voice, freedom of expression. And but when the Clinton administration explained it to the Congress why we should have China join the WTO, they may have oversold that. Some of the rhetoric may have been oversold. I think the net effect of this was a sense of disillusion by some people, and many of these people became voters for Donald Trump. For example, there was a study done at MIT that said that the U.S. Had lost something like 2.5 million factory jobs to China as a result of China joining the World Trade Organization. Many of those people then became Trump voters, and they said, you know, we lost our jobs, but nothing really changed in China, and therefore we feel deceived. So yes, there has been a backlash, and if you look at the plans of the Trump administration now, I think there are going to be some problems in terms of trade relations within the WTO, or perhaps even outside the WTO.
Well, thank you so much for being part of this dialogue and for your forecast on the future relationship between Washington and Beijing. We're going to have a year of uncertainty, but sure, people like you are cautiously optimistic, and I hope our viewers would also share your caution and your note of optimism. I thank you so much, and Merry Christmas.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the interview and the interesting questions.